Hi, and welcome to the Peak Endurance Podcast. My name is Isabel Ross, and I am the coach at Peak Endurance Coaching. Episode 80 is another interview with the brilliant author Matt Fitzgerald. Last time I interviewed him about his book 80-20, which discusses the concept of running easy for 80% of your training and hard for 20%. This interview this time focuses on another of his book, the very popular How Bad Do You Want It? I bought this book a long time ago and loved it. I read it a few times, in fact. This book is all about the mindset required for running well. Are injuries or niggles ruining your enjoyment of running and hindering your running performance? Get on top of these now so that you can get back to the pure joy that is running. Come in and see the specialists at Health and High Performance, where utilising the latest in technology and experience so that they can help you to get back to your running best. Head to healthhp.com.au/run to book an appointment and get back to that feeling of how good it is to be running without pain or discomfort. You can, of course, also find them on Instagram, Health High Performance. Thank you so much for supporting the podcast. I really appreciate the people who take that time to go over to Apple Podcasts to rate, review, and subscribe. I read all of the reviews, and they sure do inspire me and motivate me to keep working on this. Thanks so much. If you do enjoy this episode, please go on over and rate and review. I am aiming for 100 reviews by Easter next year, 2021. Will you help me achieve my goal? I hope so. I don't know about you, but I'm already planning the races I want to do in the quickly approaching new year. And lots of races are springing up to make up for this year. If you are too, email me, isabel@peakendurancecoaching.com.au, to organise an individualised training plan specific for your goals. Next week's interview is one I'm very excited about. I chat with Lazarus Lake about how he comes up with such interesting race concepts and what he thinks it will take for a female to complete the fun run or even the full race at Barkley if it's at all possible. Make sure you tune in for that one. It's a good one. But so is this one, so enjoy the interview with Matt. Hi, Matt, and welcome back to the Peak Endurance Podcast.
It's great to be back.
Excellent. So I personally myself, I'm sure many of your listeners have, read your book, How Bad Do You Want It?, which is all about mastering the psychology of mind over muscle. What prompted you to write that book?
Well, as any endurance athlete can tell you, the mind plays a huge role in endurance sports. I started running when I was just a schoolboy, and that was, I remember I describe it in the book, my first, long distance running experience. And to me, it was just shocking, the kind of discomfort and suffering I experienced. I mean, running was running. Every kid is familiar with that, but trying to run fast over an extended distance is very different. And I was really blown away by how painful it was. And ever since then, I have felt that the ability to handle that discomfort and then the other mental challenges that come with being an endurance athlete, in both in the training and the competition, can be decisive in terms of how much you enjoy the sport, how much you improve, how competitive you are, and it's become a fertile time in terms of the research, the science. Psychologists and neuroscientists and others are exploring, what is it? Why is it so challenging? What's going on inside our skulls that makes endurance competition unique, different from golf and any other sport. And also, what are the factors that make, the extremely mentally fit athletes different from people like the athlete I was. I just also describe it in the book. I was a classic head case, as they say, in high school. I was, the mental game was my weakness initially. And so, why are some athletes, naturals in that regard? And how do you develop those qualities if you aren't born with them?
And I wonder, are we ever really born with them?
Well, I would say some more than others, clearly, and there's some science. I mean, it's a very interesting. I mean, certainly, I would say none of us has ever. It's a lot like physical talent. Some people are born with more than others, but everyone can get better, and I think that's true on the mental side. The example I often give when people make that point is, for example, there's research showing that anxiety, tendency toward what they call trait anxiety. Anyone can feel anxious in a moment, but some people have anxiety as a trait, and that is partly genetically rooted. So you can be born with having a predisposition toward anxiety, and anxiety is known to be performance hindering. So if you're, just someone who had, the luck of the draw and was born with some of those genes, you might not ever be the mentally fittest endurance athlete on the planet. Okay. But, none of us is the physically most talented athlete on the planet either. Well, one person is,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? So that's where I prefer to keep the focus. And I present myself as an example, a case in point, because as I said, I was a head case. I don't think I did really have, maybe I didn't give myself enough credit, because looking back, I feel like I was holding myself to a high standard, and that's part of the reason I saw myself as a coward. But I'm also, without question, I have improved greatly in that regard. So if I can, I think any athlete who sets their mind to it also can.
Yep. And your book certainly helps with that. So as I said earlier before we started recording, I thought I have some questions basically from each chapter, which gives the listeners a bit of an idea. So the first chapter was, you talk about a race is like a firewalk. What does that mean?
Yeah, I like that firewalk metaphor that encapsulates the mental dimension of the challenge of endurance racing. And the idea is this, just imagine a bed of hot coals. I've actually never done a fire walk, so this is all theoretical for me. But imagine a bed of hot coals, and of course, walking on it is uncomfortable. And it doesn't go on forever. It has a finite length, and at the end of that bed of coals is, kind of a wall that represents your absolute physical limit. So when you get to that wall, there's no more room for you to improve physically. And so a race is like you start off at the far end of that bed of hot coals, and you start walking toward that wall. And the closer you get to the wall, representing your ultimate physical limit, which is what we all want, right? If we're committed to the sport, to fulfill our potential, the more uncomfortable it becomes. And what this in the book, I focus on what's known as the psychobiological model of endurance performance, developed by a scientist named Samuela Marcora and others. And according to that model, which I believe is essentially true, everyone jumps off that bed of hot coals at some point before they reach the wall. In other words, what the research is showing is that the limits we actually encounter as endurance athletes are psychological, not physical. Those physical limits do exist, but we're actually not capable of reaching them because we always encounter a psychological limit first.
Is that like the central governor?
It's different. Those are sort of competing theories. I mean, they have a certain degree of agreement. So, Timothy Noakes, a legendary South African exercise physiologist, he was the first, scientist of note to really embrace the idea that the brain is where it's at in endurance sports. And he developed, this, central governor theory. That one is more, it's more rooted in the idea that there are automatic triggers that prevent us. So the idea is that your brain on a mostly subconscious level is constantly receiving signals from your body during exercise, and your body sort of letting your brain know whether there's any danger, because in principle, you could exercise yourself to death if there were no protective mechanisms, right? You could overheat, or you could completely run out of glucose and just kind of keel over, whatever. But that never happens, right? Or almost never happens. And so Tim Noakes, his idea was that, well, our brains just sort of shut down. They stop firing our muscles when the warning signals from the muscles or other organs say we're too close to a limit. You got to shut it down. The Samuel Marcora's competing theory is that, that theory is too clever by half. And what's really going on is we just voluntarily slow down or stop.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, you don't need that central governor to really explain something that, a 10-year-old could say, well, no, I just quit because it hurt too much.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's fair enough. So is that, when you talk about the 30-second reserve, can you explain that one?
Yeah. So, I mean, take running as an example. Running is, it could be sprinting, right? Very short races. But at some point, when you increase the distance of a race, there's a transition where you're no longer sprinting and you're in endurance racing now. And so what is the dividing line? Like what actually makes the difference? And what it appears to be, according to the science, is that there's a certain duration for which you can sustain an all-out effort. And it's actually not very long. Like even in like a 100-meter sprint, athletes are slowing down involuntarily because and that's purely physiological. But if you go a little bit beyond that, then you get to the point where still, like, any sprinter will tell you, well, I'm trying as hard as I can. I may be slowing down, but it truly is involuntary, They're still running as fast as they can in the last 10 meters, but their bodies can't do it anymore. But when you get to longer races, say, to go back to the track and running, like 400 meters, 500, 600 meters, you get to a point where actually, if you want to get to the finish line in the least amount of time possible, you can't run as fast as you can at the start. You have to, so the difference maker, what separates a sprint from an endurance race is pacing. Yep. Where you actually have to intentionally hold back. The goal is the same. It's still to get to the finish line in the least amount of time possible, but strategically there's a crucial difference, which is that pacing factor. And what's some clever, I describe in the book a cleverly designed study that showed where that threshold is, where they had people sprint for 15, 30, or 45 seconds. But they in some cases they told them they were sprinting a different distance than they actually were. But what they found is that that's not what it was. They were told to try as hard as they could. It's been a while since I wrote the book, so I'm a fuzzy on a few things. But what it was is that the sprints were 15, 30, and 45 seconds, and they were told to go all out, to not pace themselves, no matter, regardless of the distance or the duration rather of the sprint. And what they found was, even when they were doing the 45-second sprint, when the runners were still told to go all out, when measurements of their muscle activity found that they actually were holding back at the beginning. Like they almost couldn't even help it because they knew it was 45 seconds. They knew they couldn't sustain an all-out effort for 45 seconds. So that's the idea there. I mean, it's going to be different for different individuals, but somewhere in that 30 to 45 second area, there's that transition is going to occur where you're going to have to hold back to get to the finish line as fast as possible.
Yep, and that's fair enough. In the chapter Brace Yourself, you talk about always expecting your next race to be your hardest yet. Why is this a good strategy?
Yeah, I mean, even non-athletes are familiar with the psychological coping mechanism of bracing for a painful or uncomfortable or challenging experience. What you're really doing in your mind in those moments is that you're consciously accepting that whatever it is you're going to do is going to suck. And it sounds a lot like pessimism, right? It's like, oh, I just believe it's going to rain tomorrow. But the thing is, like, if it really is going to rain tomorrow, isn't it better to know, and to accept it so you can prepare? And it's the same thing with any type of experience that is going to be painful, or in the example of an endurance race, you're going to experience high levels of discomfort. I mean, if you really race the event and try as hard as you can. And what research has shown, what is actually perceived effort, that's the essence of the type of suffering, the flavor of suffering we experience as endurance athlete is, psychologists refer to it as perception of effort. It's often colloquially, we often use the word pain to describe it, but psychologists and neuroscientists, they make a distinction. Pain is one thing, perceived effort is another. They're similar, but they're not exactly the same. But a lot of the research that applies to endurance sports and perceived effort is done with pain, because they do bear a family resemblance, and pain, it's a little easier to study. But what studies on pain have shown is that when people brace themselves for a painful stimulus, it's not that they feel it less, but they can tolerate it more. So the opposite of bracing yourself is kind of like denial, or just, wishful thinking or magical thinking, where you just sort of, you foolishly hope it's not going to hurt, even though you have every reason to believe, like, well, it hurt last time, I'm about to do it again. Maybe it won't hurt this time. Well, that's not. And there's research also, not a lot, but a little bit in the endurance space as well, to show that if they'll have psychologists do a little intervention with people to train them in basically bracing themselves, in accepting the discomfort that's going to be inevitable. And one study I'm thinking of, that people who were actually physically untrained, it was done in sedentary people, they experienced, I think it was like a 15% increase in performance in time to exhaustion without any physical exercise, just by receiving this training in what is known as acceptance and commitment theory. So being trained to brace themselves. Yeah. I mean, that really, in a nutshell, shows you how powerful the mind is, because you can get better at endurance without doing any endurance training at all.
Sounds perfect. Now, you also talk about time being on our side. What is the importance of that?
Well, yeah, that's my chapter on Greg LeMond. I focus on, so in each chapter of this book, I tell a story about a real, usually household name, but not always, like a top endurance athlete who experienced some challenge that was, psychological in nature, or, in Greg LeMond's case, he had a hunting accident. He almost died. So that's physical, but I mean, obviously there's a psychological component to, to having to come back from that kind of setback. Excuse me. And in the so Greg LeMond had won the Tour de France in 1986, and then he had this hunting accident, and then he comes back, and then in 1989 he has a big showdown with Laurent Fignon. And it comes down to the final time trial on the final day. And, LeMond is behind, and he has to really pull a rabbit out of a hat in order to make up. He's just about a minute behind Fignon. He has to make up that difference in not a lot of time. So he has to ride the time trial of his life. But it's all mathematical, right? He knows how much he has to outride Fignon by. He knows the distance he has to cover, about how long it's going to take, and about how fast he has to go. So all of these numbers he actually just uses to his advantage. And in that chapter, I get into the research on goal setting and goal achievement, and what it shows is that, because really, I often say the purpose of a goal is not to achieve it. It's a goal's purpose is to get the best out of yourself. So whether you actually technically achieve a goal or not, if you can look back and say, hey, by at least trying to achieve that goal, I couldn't have done any better. Like, that's what you want to be able to say afterward. And what the research has shown is that to get the best out of yourself, the goal you set has to be barely achievable. Like, it has to be achievable. You can't, I mean, there are no real miracles in endurance sports. It has to be something that really physically you're capable of doing, but you're going to stretch yourself the most if it's not easy, And in fact, it's very, very hard. So you have to believe you can do it, but you have to know you're going to have to turn yourself inside out. And that's exactly the situation Greg LeMond was in. Spoiler alert, he ended up, winning that tour by 8 seconds. I think it was the closest finish ever.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's a chapter that, so time is on your side is like, you don't want to become like too dependent. Like you see a lot of athletes who are like device dependent these days and they stop listening to their bodies. That's a crutch, not a tool. But, objective feedback can be a tool. If you stay in the driver's seat and control that data, you can use those metrics to set goals that really stretch yourself to fulfill your potential.
I like it that they should be barely achievable. In the chapter, The Art of Letting Go, you say that self-consciousness increases perceived effort and reduces endurance performance. So how can we avoid this if we are self-conscious of our efforts?
Yeah. I mean, obviously it's impossible to be 100% non-self-conscious, like to have like zero awareness even of your own body. That would be weird. That's obviously not really the goal. But there are degrees of self-consciousness. So that chapter is really about the phenomenon of choking, which is, like underachievement in competition. And choking is usually, if two athletes are just talking about it, they'll usually attribute choking to pressure, right? You feel the pressure and it makes you underperform. But that is true, but it's actually the mechanism is self-consciousness. It's the perceived pressure heightens self-consciousness, and that's what causes you to underperform, because it makes you overthink things that you normally are able to do kind of automatically. And think of things like stage fright or public speaking, where a lot of people choke in that situation, and it's because they become very self-conscious. Like, am I going to screw up, or do people think I look funny, or whatever it is. You get on stage, everyone's looking at you, you feel the pressure, and then suddenly something you can do very easily in other environments, talk. you can't do it anymore. People will freeze on stage or with a microphone in front of them. And, it happens in athletics as well. So, to get back to your question, I tell a story of an American triathlete named Siri Lindley, she was considered a shoo-in to qualify for the first U.S. Olympic triathlon team in 2000, but she choked in 2 qualifying races, did not make the team. But then, she realized that she had some work to do. To overcome that vulnerability to choking. She did that work, and then she came back the next year in 2001 and won the world championship. So she's sort of the proof that this is possible. And the way she did it, becoming less self-conscious, was she worked with her new coach, Brett Sutton, to get back in touch with simply enjoying the sport. The pressure for her, she felt like she had to achieve at a very high level in order to value herself as a person. All this stuff gets back into, childhood relationships with parents and stuff. It gets messy, but wherever it comes from, if you have a tendency towards self-consciousness and, perceiving pressure and choking, you probably know it. And the solution is going to be some version of that. Sort of the opposite of that is, what's called the flow state, right? Where your consciousness actually just disappears into what you're doing. And something that really facilitates that flow state, which kind of corrects, excessive self-consciousness, is enjoyment. And that's how Siri did it. She just, like, her coach said, forget that you're even a pro. Like you started doing triathlon because it was fun, because you liked it. Let's start doing that again. Just do the next workout, not, because you have to win a gold medal or a world championship, but because you want to do the next workout. You want to be there doing that, even if it's the last workout you ever do. It's an end in itself. And she really embraced that process, and it worked for her. There's a tendency to think that, like, we have a choice. We can either enjoy the sport or we can pursue excellence. That one comes at the expense of the other. nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, if you simply don't care about performance, yeah, go ahead and maximize enjoyment for its own sake. But they actually really work together. Like, you're never going to commit more to a sport, give yourself more to the process than if you're having the time of your life doing it, because then something that is hard and challenging is also fun for you at the same time. And you want to be, you don't mind the suffering you're experiencing. So yeah, I'm always, as a coach myself, I'm always encouraging athletes to finding ways to make the process as fun as possible for that reason.
Yeah. Yep. And I suppose that's also enjoying it is part of like having the goals and achieving them and enjoying that process involved in that too, I guess. Would that be right?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. There's a tension there because, people who become like Siri, too focused on the outcome, can forget the process and they stop enjoying it. But for a lot of athletes, what makes the whole thing exciting for them is that they are pursuing a goal. Like I'm very much that way. I'm willing to train really hard to achieve an ambitious goal. If I don't have a goal, a 15-minute jog feels like an eternity, and I'm not sure I want to do it. So, I need those goals in order to. It's just more enjoyable for me. Like, and not just the training and stuff, but my whole life is more enjoyable when I have those goals. Like, everything seems to line up when I have something like that out in front of me. But you just have to monitor yourself. Some people can have a tendency to obsess. They're so focused on the outcome that they forget the journey. So you want to be on guard against that.
Yep, that's a fair point. Can you explain what the workaround effect is?
Yeah, so the workaround effect, we all know, again, colloquially, what a workaround is. It's when, you sort of have a plan A for like, accomplishing a task or achieving a goal, and that path becomes blocked for whatever reason, and you need to come up with a workaround, a way to get to the same place by a different route, essentially. And of course, that's a scenario that happens in endurance sports all the time. Excuse me. In that particular chapter, I tell the story of a guy named One Arm Willie Stewart, he's called One Arm Willie because he lost an arm in a construction accident when he was just, I think, 18 years old. And he was a very high level athlete. He was actually a rugby player, or Australian rules football. But he was not an endurance athlete. He did, kind of team sports, ball sports. But later he got into running, cycling, and triathlon as a disabled athlete. Actually, he got back into initially, he went through a long depression. Which, I mean, you're 18, you lose an arm.
Definitely.
That's understandable. Yeah. But then he decided, I'm still a young guy. Like, I've got a lot of life ahead of me. I'm just going to sit here moping. And so he starts to just make a comeback to life by making a comeback as an athlete. And he sort of had, unfinished business in rugby. So before he got into endurance sports, he got back into rugby. And by the end of that process, he told me when I interviewed him that he was a better rugby player with one arm than he had been with two. And it was really because a lot of artists will say this too, like, constraints make you creative. When you can't do something the easy way, you start to innovate. You start to explore ways to develop whatever skill it is that you never would have had to rely on or resort to if the easy way had been possible. So sometimes, these setbacks, I mean, no one wants to lose an arm, but sometimes, when the easy way is blocked, it can become a blessing in disguise. And there are all kinds of examples of that. Willie Stewart being one. He became like a really good runner and triathlete and cyclist, all with one arm. And so it's that idea that, you can't wish setbacks on yourself, but they're going to happen. And when they do, it's good to recognize that the workaround effect is real. And so, as soon as possible, get over the moping phase. Oh, why did this have to happen? and start looking for workarounds. And you have to be sort of open-minded and creative, because you're not going to know the alternative route that's going to get you where you want to go initially. Initially, you're just going to be clueless. And that can be stressful in and of itself, just to not know. It's like, well, I don't want to quit. I still want to find a way, but I don't know the way. And it becomes this sort of exploratory trial and error process. It's like, well, how do I do it, differently than the way I was going to? But it's possible. And in a way, when you get to where you want to go, it's even more rewarding for having been difficult, because you didn't end up getting there the way you thought you were going to. It becomes actually a more fulfilling journey.
And I suppose we can almost apply that to the current global situation with, lockdowns and lack of races, and having to be a little bit more creative with our training and what we're training for.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I've really enjoyed, again, you don't wish these things to happen, but I've enjoyed seeing how, resilient athletes and coaches have been adapting, because they really are, I've written a bit about this, where athletes and coaches have found new methodologies or new approaches that, again, they tell me, I would not have found this if the pandemic hadn't happened. But guess what? When life goes back to normal, if it goes back to normal, I'm going to keep this. Things that they've discovered, they plan to keep using, even when they could technically go back to the old way of doing things. So yeah, that's a great example right there.
Yeah, excellent. In chapter 6, you say failure is a gift. That's sometimes a bit of pill to swallow. How can we do that? How can we reframe it like that?
Yeah, well, failure is, first of all, inevitable in endurance sports. If you never fail, then you need to set higher goals. Again, you can do these sports for any reason you want, but if you're all competitive, the game is really just about seeing how good you can be. And there's no way to become the best athlete you can be without failing along the way. So that's number one, is, the inevitability of failure. But if you talk to any athlete who actually says, you know what, I did realize my full potential, or I got really, really close, they will tell you, to a man, to a woman, failure helped me get there. Yeah. So they're going to happen regardless, but it's athletes who are actually able to use their failures who fulfill their potential, or fulfill most of their potential, or fulfill it most quickly. So it's that old expression, the obstacle is the way. Where the story I tell in that book is of Cadel Evans, the cyclist, who he has the distinction of being the winner of the Tour de France, who lost the Tour more times than anyone else before he won it. So he lost it, I think, 7 times. He won it in his 7th or 8th Tour. Like I said, I wrote this book a while ago. But point being, he was one of these people. He was considered destined from the earliest age to win the Tour. Like, he was just this prodigal talent. He had
I used to actually race mountain bikes with him when he was younger.
Right on. Okay, so I don't need to tell you, but he was like the golden boy. It's like keep an eye on this one. He's going to win the Tour one day. And finally, he did mountain biking first and kicked butt. And then goes into the Tour, and then he loses. Then he comes. Well, I'm still young. It was just my first Tour. He comes back, loses again. He's improving though, so it's like, well, next year, that's the year. Comes back, loses again, and then it's like, then he's not so young anymore. And then he's no longer actually improving. He gets up to 2nd place. He's on the podium, but then he starts going back the other way. And people started to write him off, but then he ends up winning anyway. And for him, the point I make in through his story is that, he had every ingredient. He had the talent, he had the experience, he had the resources, he was only missing one thing. And that really was that little extra bit of resilience. And the reason he didn't have that is because he had everything else. You know what I mean? Like, he had to sort of earn the resilience, because all he ever did was win. he just started off, and so there's, unless you're truly absolutely born with it in some way, and with resilience, I don't know how that happens. Like you have to experience, you have to fail.
Yeah.
And the real difference, when you dig deep into his whole story and look at, okay, what was different? Because was he actually a better athlete, when he finally won, in his mid-30s?
Yeah.
Probably not. But he had what I refer to in the book as, well, actually a psychologist coined the phrase, sweet disgust. So it was like, I also describe it as the fed up feeling.
Yeah.
So sometimes like failure can it can either break you or it can make you angry. And anger can really, properly channeled anger can be performance enhancing, where you're just like, you know what? I'm not even scared of losing anymore because I'm tired of losing. Like, like I'm tired of failing. Like I'm pissed off. Like this time I'm going to get it done. Like that was his attitude. And that was the difference maker for him. And he had failure to thank for that. Like he wouldn't have won it the seventh time if he hadn't failed the first six. And, failure is unpleasant, it's disappointing, by definition. But if you just recognize that these things are true, you can sort of quickly, sort of get over the disappointment and realize, oh, there's an opportunity here. Like, when my story is written, I could have this failure to thank for my ultimate success.
Yep. Yeah, and I think we can also learn so many lessons from our failures too, if we really
sometimes very specific lessons.
Yeah,
like, all right, I failed because of this. I'm not going to fail for the same reason again. I'm going to address that specific reason I failed. Yes, very much so.
Yeah, no, definitely, and it certainly does build resilience. That's for sure. In chapter 8, the answer is inside you, talks about perfectionism and how this can lead to training and racing errors if it's misplaced. A lot of athletes consider themselves to be type A personalities, which is inherent in perfectionism. So how does that work? Isn't it important to be a perfectionist to make sure that you do everything right? How can it turn against us?
Yeah, great question. There's some pretty cool research that I delved into again in writing. I have another book coming out, kind of a follow-up to How Bad You Want It, and I delved into the research on perfectionism, and it really is a double-edged sword. And we kind of know that through our own experience. It's like it seems to help sometimes and hurt other times, and that the research really bears that out. So it depends a little bit on the individual, like the specific style of perfectionism they have. Because one type of perfectionism, and the type that is really more helpful, is when you have sort of a mastery mindset, where your goal is to just master a skill, to be as good at it as you can possibly be, sort of trusting that will take you to your goals or will result in winning. But the focus is actually more on the mastery than on the winning. The other style of perfectionism that is not as helpful is really fear of failure. And that is fear-based. And that can be, fear very often is self-sabotaging, actually. It kind of, it just sort of tightens you. You're not, there should be all athletes compete at their best when they're a little bit loose. They're serious, but they're also playing. They kind of have a light hold on their goals. And that style of perfectionism where I can't possibly lose. That's the end of the world if I lose. That's not as healthy. It's not as pleasant a state to be in, but it's also, you're probably not going to actually perform as well. So that mastery mindset is like a better way to be perfectionistic as an athlete.
Yeah, so it's about channeling it correctly so that we don't overtrain, which is often overtraining. Certainly, it can lead to choking in races, I guess, but also it can lead to overtraining and those sorts of training errors. Would you say too?
Yeah. The narrative focus of that chapter is the legendary Paula Newby Fraser, 8-time winner of the Ironman World Championship, and she was unbeatable. At the height of her powers, in her prime. I mean, she was like, I want to say I describe it in the opening of the chapter. I think she finished something like 14th overall in the it's only the best 13 men in Ironman racing could beat her. Like, I mean, she was so far ahead of all the other women, but she sort of, in a way, she threw it away because of perfectionism. Even though she was so much better than her real competition, she still lived in fear that they were going to catch up to her. And so she ended up messing up her formula. I refer to it, to get back to your overtraining comment, I refer to it as the hard work security blanket, where it's actually a kind of laziness that a lot of very driven athletes can fall into. And you're like, well, how can hard work be lazy? It's mentally lazy. It's intellectually lazy, because success in endurance sports requires, it's not all one thing. It requires that you use the full toolkit. And when people try to make working harder the solution to everything, it's actually a kind of laziness. That they, if they have a bad workout or a bad race, they're like, oh, I just need to work harder. If they start to feel bad in training, oh, I just need to work harder. So they want that one thing to be the answer to whatever is holding them back, whatever the problem might be. That's lazy. You know what I mean? Like, you're not willing to do the intellectual work to actually, come up with a balanced approach to getting better that uses, the full toolkit. So that's a trap I see athletes fall into all the time, that hard.
Hang on a second, you've just dropped out. I just missed that last bit that you said. It's a trap they fall into. Yes,
the hard work security blanket, as I call it. Yeah, you have to work hard, but most endurance athletes are willing to do that. It's like, the question is, are you willing to do the other things?
Yeah, that's right. All right, so many of my listeners are, ultra runners, and so they often train alone. But you also talk about the group effect. So how is that important, and why should ultra runners maybe take more notice of that one?
Yeah, human beings are social animals, and we behave differently in groups than we do alone, including in the athletic context. That chapter of the book focuses on the 2010 World Cross Country Championships, in which the American men's team knocked off mighty Kenya, who they used to win it almost every year. They actually still do. The Americans finished second, silver. So it's Ethiopia first, the Americans second, and then Kenya third. Like, really, we really celebrated here, American running fans. And so I get into the whole, the rise of Kenya's dominance in endurance running. And a lot of people, they just sort of, to get back to intellectual laziness, they say, oh, they have a genetic advantage. And, when you scratch the surface and look at the science, it's really hard to back that up. And also, if you look at, like, just sport, all the full panoply of different sports. I mean, there's a million different sports out there, all over the world, and most major sports are actually dominated by 1, 2, or 3 countries. Like take men's football. Either Germany or Brazil wins the World Cup every 4 years. It's like, well, is that a genetic advantage? And what are the genes that Brazilians and Germans only on the men's side? You know what I mean? Like. Yeah. So there's so many other factors, most of them social and cultural, that explains national sporting dominance. And what, America used to be very dominant in running, like in the 1970s. And then we kind of lost it. And people in this country who really cared about sort of, getting back to the top, they question, why are the Kenyans so good? And they wanted the real answer, not the easy answer. And what they found is that they trained in groups. There's more than one thing. A lot of them, certain tribes, they live at high elevation. They're born and raised at high elevation. The diet is conducive. There aren't a lot of other sports to choose from. It's a poor country, so it's one of the only ways to get rich. So it's very motivating. But that group factor seems to be to loom large. That by training in groups, they're able to raise themselves to a higher level. Like everyone gets a little bit better by virtue of being in that context. And again, research science really backs this up, where there have been studies to show, for example, that athletes have a higher pain tolerance after doing a workout as a group than if they do exactly the same performance test on their own, and then their pain tolerance is tested, it's lower. And that's because it's called behavioral synchrony. So when you do the same thing that other people are doing at the same time, your brain releases endorphins that actually mask pain to a certain, they're natural, biological, biochemical painkillers. So it's almost like a performance enhancing drug. It's just training and racing with other athletes, and it's not just competition; it's cooperation as well. It's both. You benefit from both. So, and that's if you're human. Even I'm kind of an introvert, but I've experienced it too. Like 3 summers ago, I spent the entire summer training with a team of professional runners, and at the very end of it, I had the best marathon I've ever had at the age of 46. Yeah. So I know it even just from anecdotal experience that it's fine. I do most of my training alone, but just know that you're probably leaving some performance on the table if you never train with other athletes.
Yep, no, I'd agree with that. In chapter 10, you talk about how our internal expectations enhance our racing. Like rather than going out thinking, I'm slow, I can't do well, those sorts of things. How do we balance our expectations?
Yeah, I mean, that's another thing that most of us probably recognize from just life experience, is that expectations tend to be self-fulfilling. So when you expect the best, you get the best. When you expect the worst, you get the worst. So you can sort of take advantage of that by consciously manipulating your own expectations. Like you can do that with goal setting, but also in other ways. And again, the whole idea is just to get the best. I call it benign self-manipulation, where like you toy with the contents of your own mind in such a way to set yourself up for success. So, for example, there's science to back up this notion. There was a study done with ultra runners where they measured, before all these runners were going to do, I believe it was a French ultra trail race with a very high failure rate, where more than half the field failed to finish each year, and they measured a lot of different psychological factors, but one of them they measured was expectation of finishing. And as you might expect, those who had a stronger expectation of finishing were more likely to complete the distance. Even though in the group as a whole, a majority failed to finish, those who had the highest expectation of finishing, it fulfilled itself. The limit on that is you can't get yourself to believe something you don't actually believe. Like you have to truly believe it. Like if you're lying to yourself, it's not going to work, because you actually know you're lying to yourself. So in the training process, a huge purpose of the training process is to build your expectations, to develop, like basically to prove to yourself that you can achieve the things you want to achieve. So as a coach, that's what I want. Like I don't want to just physically prepare an athlete to achieve a goal. I want to give them experiences that actually teach them, that show them that they can do what they want to do. Because if they bring that to the starting line as well, they're standing there not just physically capable of doing it, but knowing in their minds that they can do it, and that can make all the difference.
Yeah, I guess it's part of the trust the training, so that you know that if you've done the training, your expectation of completing is that much higher.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's like if you know you can do it, even if it's hard,
Yeah,
there's no substitute for that. Just knowing it.
exactly. Yeah. Now, in chapter 11, you talk about passion knows no age. What are you talking about there?
Yeah, well, as an aging endurance athlete, this is.
Yeah, I know.
But it's interesting. When I was, I mentioned I started running when I was quite young.
Mm,
I'll turn 50 next year, so I've been at it for a long time. And when I was sort of in my supposed prime year, late 20s and into my 30s, I used to wonder, when I start slowing down, because I was so motivated to improve. It's what it was all about for me. It's like, I want to get faster. I want to get faster. It's like, well, what happens when I'm not getting faster anymore? Will I just quit and start golfing and instead? But,
no, start ultras.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, actually that did happen.
Yeah.
But, in that story, in that chapter, I tell the story of Ned Overend, who was a great, well, he was a multidisciplinary endurance athlete, but he was a world champion American mountain biker. And then later in his career, this new sport discipline came along, off-road triathlon. And he's kind of like decided to just give it a go. And he ends up becoming, at the age of 43, the world champion in off-road triathlon. So just, there's a mountain biking part, and that's what he made his name doing before. But still, I mean, he had to swim and run as well. And he was 43. And he came back the next year and won again. And I believe he was like the oldest world champion in any major endurance sport. And you see more and more of that now. Like athletes are truly, sort of redefining the possible. What was it? Tommy, I'm going to blank on his last name, but Irish runner he's 61 years old and he just ran a 1 hour and 11-minute half marathon.
Oh, wow. No, I didn't know about that.
Yeah. No, he was a world-class runner in his 20s. He's
wow.
not a Johnny come lately, but still, I mean, just to think about how little he has slowed down in 40 years, it's incredible. And you see, stuff like this is happening all over the place now. And if you look at what's going on with these athletes, because it doesn't happen to everyone, like not every endurance athlete ages equally well. And a huge factor in the ones who are able to sort of extend their prime, past 40, and sometimes well past 40, are those who remain very passionate for the sport. So they still love it. The hunger is still there. The fire is still burning. You see that in example after example. And in the book, in that chapter, I look at some of the research on longevity. So just outside of the athletic context, like people who age well just as human beings, you see exactly the same thing. People who really are passionate about, no one's really passionate about life. They're passionate about things in life. And people who they just remain really attached to being alive. They're anchored to it by something that they do, or could be sort of more of a relationship-based thing, whatever it is, like whatever your outlet for your passion is. Like if you're able to continually stoke that and find ways to keep that thing vibrant and flourishing as you get older, the aging process is just not going to move as quickly in you as it will in other people. And I mean, if you decide you want to move on and golf instead of running, I mean, that's fine. But for me, like I still love running, and I still have that competitive mindset. I'm wired the same way. I want to see what I can do. And I have found just in my own, training and racing that finding ways, athletes often don't realize how much freedom they have to do it however they want to. Like Ned Overend, the guy I focus on in this book, like one of the ways he kept his hunger alive was actually to just get away from the sport to a certain degree. Like he was not a super heavy trainer. Like he would take time off. He would just he would prioritize other things sometimes. Like he liked to maintain balance, and you would think, oh, that's the opposite of passion. No, like by just like that was his way of not exhausting his passion for the sport, to have other things going on in his life, just to have it like be, yes, an important thing, but not the only thing in his life. But for other people, the formula might be a little different. For me, I find ways to mix my writing together with my training. So I come up with projects that I just think, oh, this is the coolest thing ever, and I'll get to write about it. Like, that fake pro runner experience I mentioned briefly a few years ago, that was exactly that. Like, it was something I wanted to do as a runner, but I turned it into this writing thing where I could share this experience of being a middle-aged fake professional runner that just made it exciting and thrilling for me to do. And it ended up benefiting my running and being something cool to write about and share with other people.
Yeah, I do. I've always felt that it's really important to have a passion. And I mean, obviously we're biased and we think it should be running, but obviously it doesn't really matter, So chapter 12 is called, Is It Worth It? This is talking about, from my understanding, or finding your why, because certainly when you're deep in an ultra, and that's sometimes why people DNF, is they haven't got a significant why to keep going. Is that kind of also part of it as well?
Yeah, that's exactly it. The title of the book is How Bad Do You Want It? And, so that's kind of a recurring refrain in the book. And the idea is that when, because endurance racing is hard, you have that moment, in almost every race where, that thought just comes unbidden to you in the depths of the pain cave, like, why am I doing this? And so there's almost like this shouting match between two competing voices in your head. Like, one part of you just doesn't want it that bad and doesn't want to suffer. Another part of you is the reason you're there in the first place. And really you want that voice to win the shouting match. It's like, well, how do you get that to happen? And really, kind of the way to look at it, or the way I look at it, is like, your reason for wanting to suffer however much it is going to be necessary to give your best effort. The stakes have to be as close to life and death as possible. Like, it's not literally like your life doesn't depend on giving it all you've got in races, but whatever your most central motivation is, the closer it is to that, the better. Like, so people who have more, like, sort of like shallower motivations, like, well, I'm here because my friend talked me into it. Well, okay. That's only going to take you so far.
Yeah.
Or it's like, I'm running 100 miles because I wanted to lose 5 kilos. It's like, well,
there are easier ways, I reckon.
Exactly. Why not just not eat for a week?
Yeah.
That's actually easier.
That's easier.
But, and again, part of what I love about this is just how disparate people's motivations are. Like, we don't all have the same motivational profile. For me, I have more than one, but a big one for me was I wanted, I quit running as, in the end of high school because I couldn't take the suffering. And I didn't run for a while. And when I got back into it, one of my big motivators was to change how I saw myself as a man. Like, I saw myself as mentally weak, and I wanted to change that. And that was a very powerful motivator. Like, I wanted to use running as a vehicle to become a stronger human being, and to be able to sort of look at myself in the mirror and say, you know what, you're strong. So I had to prove that to myself, and it was incredibly motivating. But it's different for different people. Like, I know I'm not a parent myself, but I know some parents, they're really fueled by wanting to set a certain kind of example to their children, and that fires them up more than anything else. For other people, it's more of like even like a spiritual thing or a connection to a higher power. Like, that's their big driver. Whatever it is, like, find it, for yourself and connect with it. Not just throughout the training, but especially in those moments when you need that you need that why as kind of a lifeline to get you through, crucial moments and events.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that it's probably very important to consider all of that before the race and have that ready to go.
Exactly so, yes.
Yeah. Now, you talked earlier about your new book, and that's called The Comeback Quotient. And you said it's like a part 2 or a follow-on from this book. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely similar themes. And, it mines and it delves into, endurance sports psychology. So the question I wanted to address in that book is, even as fans of sport, we all love an amazing comeback story, right? And you see them in all different sports, when someone has like a major setback or failure or what have you, and then comes back and achieves like a thrilling and exciting victory. It's fun to watch, but if you're an athlete yourself, you also want to be capable of these things, because we all find ourselves in situations where we need to make a comeback. We need to come back from something. And don't you want, as an athlete yourself, don't you want to be one of the ones who can pull off a feat that makes other people say, wow, and inspires other people? And so this book explores the question, like, what is it? What's the special sauce that the athletes who achieve the most amazing comebacks have? Like, and really the question I pose at the outset is like, are they all, there's all different varieties. Like on the surface, no two comebacks look the same. But the question I pose is like, underneath, are they actually all doing the same thing? Are they all going through the same fundamental process? And I believe they are. And so that's what it's very similar in that the book, it mixes storytelling with science. But this one, the complaint I got from How Bad You Want It was that it wasn't quite practical enough. It's definitely like, well, it's definitely more inspirational. It's not like a step 1, step 2, step 3 sort of.
True.
The Comeback Quotient is a little bit more like that. It's a little bit, hopefully it's inspiring as well, but it gets a little bit into the nuts and bolts of, I sort of coach the reader through the process of becoming what I call, the term I use is ultra realist. So the people who pull off the amazing comebacks are ultra realists, and it's a book about how to become one yourself.
Well, that sounds really interesting, and I can't wait to read that. And hopefully you can come back and we can have a chat about that book too.
I would love to.
Excellent. All righty. Well, so we were obviously talking about How Bad Do You Want It? And once again, I can highly recommend that book. I've loved reading it. I bought that quite a few years ago, actually, so it's well read. Thank you so much for once again taking the time to chat with me. And I'll once again put your details in the show notes so people can follow you and see what you're doing and those sorts of things.
Thanks. I really enjoyed talking to you.
No worries. Thanks so much. Bye.